Cora Bellamy knelt over a trunk of spelling primers while the township chairman told the room she would not last. "The poor thing jumps at a slammed door," he said, and the men nodded. "We'll want a firmer hand out here by spring." She did not flinch. She opened a small oilcloth notebook and wrote one line low on the page and closed it again. At the schoolhouse dedication, Vernon Crade patted her shoulder before 11 board members. "City nerves. She'll see nothing out here but chalk dust and weather." Behind him, 3 barns had already burned that season. Nobody counted them out loud. "Watch her hand." Steady, sketching a boot heel worn down to the nails. One word under the drawing. Rio. She wrote it, and she said nothing. And she buried the book in her coat. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Ash Hollow, Kansas, autumn of 1931. The kind of year that dried the creeks to cracked mud and thinned the wheat to nothing. Dust hung in the light like it had a right to. The bank in the county seat had swallowed 2 farms already that fall, and the men who still had land walked like they were carrying it on their backs. Cora came in on the Tuesday freight with 2 trunks and a carpet bag and a coat too thin for the wind. She was a small woman, brown hair pinned plain, a face that did not ask for a second look. When the station master called out for the new teacher, she raised her hand only halfway, like she wasn't sure the name was hers. She had answers ready for the questions people ask. She'd taught back east. She wanted quiet. She had no people left to speak of. All of it was true enough to hold. None of it was the whole thing. But nobody in Ash Hollow was looking for the whole thing. They saw a nervous woman with careful hands, and they decided they already knew her. 3 landladies offered her a room that first week. 3 took the offer back, not from cruelty, from a softer thing that cuts just as deep. "She seems so delicate, Mrs." Pruitt said to the mercantile counter. "Loud enough to carry. I'd worry about her all night. She'd be better off somewhere with less stairs." And that was that. The delicate ones, you see, are a burden. Better to hand them off. So Cora took the lean to behind the mercantile. A shed. Really, a cot, a washstand, a stove the size of a bread box, and a window that looked out on the alley. She thanked Mr. Ostrander for it like he'd given her a parlor. She swept it clean. She hung her one good dress on a nail. She set the 2 trunks against the wall and did not open the second one. The schoolhouse held 31 children, ages 6 to 14, all in the one room, all in the one grade of life that was learning to make do. She taught them well, and she taught them cheap. $40 a month, and she never asked for the raise the board hinted she might earn if she settled in. She brought her own chalk when the district ran short. She patched the readers' spines with paste she cooked on the little stove. The children liked her. Children are the first to notice when a quiet person is paying close attention, and she paid the closest attention any of them had known. There is a thing she did in that first month that the town never saw, because the town was not watching her. She was watching it. One gray afternoon she sat at her desk grading sums, head down, pencil moving. 31 slates, 31 small hands of arithmetic. 2 desks over, a boy named Tommy Pruitt whispered a number to himself, working a column of figures. He carried the wrong digit. Said it under his breath, barely a sound. Cora did not look up. "Tommy," she said, still grading. "Carry the 1, not the 7. Try it again." The room went quiet. Tommy stared at his slate. He had not raised his hand. He had not spoken above a breath. He looked at her, and she was already 3 problems down her own page, marking neat little checks. He fixed it. He got it right. And he never quite forgot that the teacher who jumped at slammed doors had heard his mistake from clear across the room without lifting her eyes. That was the whole of it, in the beginning. A woman who heard things. A woman who saw things. And a town that had decided, before she ever set down her trunks, that there was nothing behind those still eyes worth looking into. The board met the first Thursday of every month in the back of the Grange Hall. Cora went because the teacher was expected to go, to sit at the end of the long table and report the attendance and take her instructions. She sat with her hands folded and her notebook closed in front of her. Vernon Crade ran the meeting the way he ran everything. Warmly, he was a big man with a big laugh and a way of touching your arm when he talked, so that even his condescension felt like a favor being done. Grain and land, that was Crade. He bought low from the desperate and sold high to the hopeful, and he had done it so long and so smoothly that the town thought of him as its friend. Its benefactor, even, chairman of the board. First to give $1 when the collection plate went around. First to be photographed doing it. What the town did not think about, because Crade had never let them, was the paper underneath the man. The mortgages he'd signed to buy that land in the good years. The notes coming due now in the bad ones. Vernon Crade was drowning in a fine suit, and only 2 men in the county knew it. And one of them was Crade. That first Thursday, he turned his warmth on Cora. "Now, Miss Bellamy," he said, "I've been thinking. These attendance figures, they can get away from a person. All those little names and dates. Why don't I take a look through your book each month, just to keep it tidy for the county? No trouble at all. Happy to lend a firmer hand where it's wanted." He smiled around the table. The men smiled back. It was such a kind offer, such a generous man to spare the nervous schoolmarm the burden of her own arithmetic. Cora said, "Thank you, Mr. Crade. That's very good of you." And she let him have the attendance book, which was accurate to the day, because she had never in her life kept a book that wasn't. She did not keep her real figures there. She had another book for those. 2 weeks later, a boy in her class knocked over the second trunk. It was recitation day, and the children were up out of their seats, and little Ruth Cobb tripped against the trunk in the corner, and the lid came half open before Cora could cross the room. Books slid out. Primers, mostly, and down among them, catching the window light. A small brass tag on a leather cord, stamped with 2 initials and a firm's name too worn to read from across a room. Ruth picked it up, curious the way children are. "What's this, Miss Bellamy?" "It's got writing." Cora took it from her hand. Gently, not a snatch. "An old employer's," she said, light as anything. "From before I taught. Just a keepsake." And she set it back in the trunk and laid the readers over it and closed the lid, and turned Ruth back toward her recitation with a hand on the shoulder. The children forgot it inside a minute. Children forget everything that isn't candy or trouble. But you saw it. Hold on to it. A brass tag, 2 initials, a firm's name. Buried under school books in a shed behind a mercantile. She said before I taught, and she said it so easily that even I almost let it pass. Almost. The Dowell barn burned on a Wednesday. 3 in the morning. By the time the men got there with buckets, there was nothing to save. Just a great orange wound in the dark, and Ada Dowell standing in her nightdress with her arms wrapped around herself. Watching a winter's hay and 2 good horses go up in a roar. The Dowells were not rich. They were the kind of steady that a barn is the whole account of. And now the account was ash. It was the 3rd barn that season. Everyone said so, standing around the black ruin the next morning. The Kessler place in September. The Voigt place in October. Now Dowell. All of them insured. All of them with Meridian Mutual Fire and Casualty, which was the only company writing policies this far out. And all of them paid up. Sheriff Amos Dwyer walked the wreckage with his hat in his hand and his face gray. He was a decent man, Dwyer. Everyone agreed on that too. Decent and tired, and one bad election from being turned out for a younger man who talked louder. He wanted to name the person doing this before the county sent someone to do it for him, and made him look the fool. He knelt in the ash. He found nothing a jury could hold. "A burned barn tells no tales," he said, and he believed it, because he had never learned to look at the things a fire doesn't touch. They brought Cora out to sit with the widow. A steadying female presence, Mrs. Pruitt called it. Someone to hold Ada Dowell's hand and pour the coffee and murmur the soft things women were supposed to murmur. So Cora went. She sat with Ada. She poured the coffee. She murmured the soft things, and she meant them, because she was not a cold woman, whatever the town thought her stillness was. But while the men stood in a knot by the road talking about how there was nothing to find, Cora walked. Slow, around the far side where the tack-room had stood off the main barn and had not fully burned. There was a window there, low, and under it a strip of ground the flames had missed and the buckets had not reached. Soft mud from the melt of the fire hose water. She crouched. She looked a long time. A boot print. Just one clean one, pressed deep where a man had stood at that window, maybe to reach in, maybe to set the thing that started it. The heel of that boot was worn down almost to the nails. Not worn like a walking man wears a heel, even and slow. Worn hard on the outer front edge, the way a heel goes when a foot rides a clutch pedal for a living. A truckman's foot. A man who drove more than he walked. She did not call anyone over. She did not point. She took out the oilcloth notebook and she drew the heel, careful, the wear pattern exact. Underneath she wrote, "Worn to the nails, clutch foot, a truckman." And she closed the book and went back inside and refilled Ada Dowell's cup. That was the first one. The first tell, set down in the ledger. She did not know yet whose foot it was, but she knew what it was, and that was more than the whole county standing out by the road. Now, the thing you have to understand about a town in a bad year is that it wants someone to blame, and it wants that someone to be far away. A stranger. A tramp off the rails. A drifter with a grudge. What it cannot stand to consider is that the fire came from inside the circle, from a man they'd shaken hands with. So the talk at the mercantile ran to hobos and to gypsies and to bad men from the next county over, and nobody looked at the fine suit at the head of the board. The Grange meeting after the Dowell fire was the fullest of the year. Every farmer with a barn still standing came to hear what the sheriff meant to do, which was nothing much, because there was nothing much he knew to do. And Vernon Crade worked that room like a man born to it. He moved among the frightened farmers with his hand out and his voice low and warm. He told the Dowells the board would take up a collection. He told the Voights the same. He was sorry, so sorry, for their losses, and every man he comforted came away feeling that Vernon Crade was the one solid thing in a season of ash. Then, near the end, when the room was tired and looking for somewhere to put its fear, Crade found his easy target. He nodded down the table toward Cora, who sat with her closed notebook, as always, at the end. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole hall, "at least our nervous schoolmarm's been keeping busy, scribbling her little lists while grown men lose their livelihoods." He chuckled, and he opened his hands to the crowd, inviting them in. "Maybe she'll teach the arsonist his letters when we catch him." 11 men laughed. Not cruel men, most of them. Just frightened men glad of somewhere to set the fear down for a second. They laughed at the small still woman with the closed book, because it was easier than being afraid. Cora looked at the table in front of her. She put one hand flat on the oilcloth cover of the notebook. She did not open it. She did not defend it. She did not say a word, and I'll tell you, this is the hard part to sit through. Because you know what's in that book. You know what she found at the Dowell window while these 11 men found nothing. You want her to open it right now and slap it down on the table and wipe the laugh off Vernon Crade's face. That's the ache of it. That's the promise this whole thing is walking toward. But she doesn't. Not yet. She's not ready. And more than that, she's not sure. A print is not a name. And a woman who has been careful her whole life does not spend her one shot early. She rose when the meeting broke. She gathered her coat. And on her way out into the cold, she passed the row of trucks and wagons parked along the Grange lot. Crade's Rio sat nearest the door, big and new, the one new thing in a lot full of old ones. Bought on credit, though nobody said so. Cora slowed as she passed the driver's side, just a step's worth. She glanced down through the window at the floor of the cab, at the pedals. At the clutch pedal, and the way the rubber of it was worn, and the way a man's left heel would ride it, mile after mile, wearing down against the outer edge. One glance. Then she pulled her thin coat tight and walked home to the shed behind the mercantile, and the wind took the sound of her steps. And no one saw her stop at all. A drummer came through in November. A traveling man selling patent medicine and bootblacking out of a case, the way they did. He took a room at the boarding house and held court at the mercantile stove for an evening, and Cora came in for lamp oil and stood waiting her turn at the counter. The drummer looked at her twice, then a third time, the way a man does when a face has caught on something in his memory. "I know you," he said. "Don't I know you?" "Chicago, was it? You worked out of an office on—" He snapped his fingers, hunting the name. "Delacroix, that's it. Miss Delacroix." "Bellamy," she said. "You've got me mixed with someone. But here is the thing, and it went by so fast that only I caught it. And I'll bet you did too." She answered to Delacroix first. Her chin came up at Delacroix. Her whole body turned toward the name a half-second before her mouth said Bellamy. The drummer didn't notice. He was already laughing it off, saying the road addled a man, saying every pretty face east of the Rockies looked like some other pretty face by November. But she noticed that she'd turned. You could see her notice it. And she paid for her lamp oil and left the store a little quicker than she'd come in, and she did not stand by the stove to get warm the way the cold night wanted her to. "Delacroix, set that beside the brass tag. Set it beside before I taught. The picture isn't finished. But it's filling in, isn't it, at the edges, in a way not one soul in Ash Hollow can see." The Pardee barn went on a Sunday night, same as before. 3 a.m, Meridian Mutual, paid up and then some. But this fire left the ring a little careless, or a little rushed, because the ground told on them. There'd been rain that week, the first real wet in a month, and the lane up to the Pardee barn was churned soft. When Cora came out the next day, again as the steadying woman, again to pour the coffee, she walked the approach while the men stood in their knot. 2 grooves ran up that muddy lane, wheel tracks, side by side, the way any wagon leaves. But the near one wasn't right. It scored a second, thinner line just inside the first, a twin groove. Faint but steady the whole length of the track. Like a wheel that didn't sit true. Like an axle that had been broken and mended with a length of chain wrapped and bolted, so it rode a hair off center and dragged its own signature through soft ground. Cora knew wagons. She knew who in Ash Hollow had a rear axle mended with chain, because she listened at the mercantile and the livery and the church steps the way other people breathed, without seeming to at all. Roy Tice, the liveryman. His freight wagon had thrown its rear axle in the summer, and he'd chained it rather than pay for new iron, and he'd complained about it to anyone who'd stand still. She crouched in the Pardee lane. She drew the twin groove. Underneath she wrote, "Chain-mended axle, rides off true, Tice's freight wagon." Second tell. Second name, though still only in her book. Still only for her eyes. The ledger was 2 lines long now, and the sheriff still had nothing. Dwyer, to his credit, had noticed the schoolteacher kept turning up at the fires and kept walking the ground. He didn't make much of it. But he was a decent man out of ideas, and out of ideas will make a man notice things he'd otherwise wave off. So when Cora came by the office with a pail of coffee and some biscuits, the way a kindly woman might, he let her sit a minute. She said, "Careful, offering it small, Sheriff. Have you looked at who holds the policies? All 4 barns. Same company. Someone writes those policies before they burn." Dwyer rubbed his eyes. He was grateful for the coffee. He was not grateful for the suggestion. "Miss Bellamy," he said, not unkind, "you leave the figuring to the county. It's good of you to sit with the widows. Truly. But this is men's work, and it's ugly. And I won't have you tangled in it." He patted the desk, the way Crade patted arms. "You've got enough on your plate with those 30 children. 31, she almost said. She didn't. She thanked him for his time, and she took the empty pail, and she went out into the cold with the whole map of it forming in her head, and not one man in that county willing to look at the pages she'd already written. That's 3 now. 3 times she's been waved off. The board laughed. The chairman mocked. The sheriff patted her hand and sent her home. Keep that count. Because every one of those small dismissals is a weight on one side of a scale, and the other side is coming, and when it drops it is going to drop all at once. It was Elias Ford who told her the thing that turned it. Elias was a young farmer, widowed early, quiet in the way that grief makes a man quiet rather than fear. He drove Cora's supplies out to the schoolhouse on the cold mornings when the road was too iced for her to walk it, and he never once talked down to her, and he never once called her delicate. He just handed down the crates and touched his hat and asked how the children were getting on. She had come to look for his wagon on those mornings more than she let herself admit. One such morning, stamping his boots against the cold, he said, almost to himself, "Deke Sennett came around again about my barn. Wants me to raise the insurance on it. Says the rate's good, says I'd be foolish not to. I told him my barn's worth what it's worth and not $1 more. He shook his head. 3rd time he's asked. I don't like a man who wants to insure a thing more than I do. Cora went very still, stiller than her ordinary stillness. Deke Sennett, she said. Cousin to the Meridian man. The adjuster out of Wichita. Writes the policies out here. Elias shrugged. Pushy, but I suppose that's the trade. And there it was. The whole shape of the thing swung around and showed its face to her in the cold morning light. The ring did not pick barns, it picked paper. Deke Sennett wrote the policies fat, for twice the barn's worth, and his cousin the adjuster paid them out without a squint, and in between the fat policy and the fat payout there was only a match and a man with a worn heel and a chained axle. They weren't burning barns. They were burning insurance forms that happened to have barns attached. And Elias Ford, who wanted nothing insured, had just told her which farmers had been leaned on to sign, which meant she now knew which barns were on the list. She thanked Elias. She watched his wagon go. And then she did a thing she had not done since the day she stepped off the freight. She went back to the shed, and she knelt by the second trunk, and she moved the readers aside. And she lifted out the brass tag on its leather cord. She held it in the window light where the 2 worn initials caught and the firm's name under them. And she read aloud, quietly, in the empty shed, a name that was not Bellamy, her own, the one the drummer almost gave away, the one on the tag, the name she'd carried in another life, in an office in Chicago, doing work that a nervous city girl was never supposed to have done. She did not say it for anyone. There was no one. She said it to remember that she'd been that person, and that she could be again, and that the town had handed her every tell she needed while it was busy laughing. The Ostrander barn burned 4 nights later. By now you know the pattern, and so did she. 3 in the morning, Meridian Mutual. She was there by dawn, coffee pail in hand, walking the ground while the men stood useless in their knot. And the Ostrander lane gave her the 4th line. A boot print, deep and clean in the frost. But this one told a different story than the dowel heel. This print drove down harder on the right than the left. Much harder, the right toe biting deep, the left barely marking. A man who threw his weight to one side when he walked, favoring an old hurt. There was only one man in Ash Hollow who walked like that, and every soul in the county knew it, and had known it for years, and had never once thought it was a clue to anything. Halbert Mundy, and the bad hip he'd carried since a horse rolled on him a decade back. His limp was a joke at the feed store. His limp was a thing children imitated. And his limp had just signed its name in the frost at the 4th fire. Cora measured it against the memory of the dowel heel and the Pardee groove. She drew it. Underneath she wrote, deep right, thrown weight, Mundy's hip. 4 fires, 4 tells, 4 men. Crade's clutch worn heel at the dowel window. Tice's chain scored axle in the Pardee lane. Mundy's lopsided print in the Ostrander frost. and Deke Senate's fat policies, written in ink before any match was struck, tying all of it to the fifth man. The cousin, the adjuster who would sign the checks, she had the whole ring in the oilcloth notebook, every one of them, and not a single person in the county would take the book from her hand if she offered it, because they had all decided months ago what a small, still woman was worth. So she made her choice, and she made it the way she'd made every choice since Chicago. Quietly, alone at dusk, she walked to the depot. The telegraph office was empty but for the clerk, half asleep over his key. She took a form, and she filled it out in her own careful hand, and she counted her coins onto the counter, and she waited while the clerk clacked it out into the wire and off into the dark toward the east. The message went to Chicago, to the Thorne Ellison Detective Agency, whose 2 initials were stamped on a brass tag buried under schoolbooks in a shed behind a mercantile. It asked 2 things. It asked them to confirm her commission, in her own name, the real one. And it asked for a records check on every Meridian Mutual policy written in Ash Hollow this past year, and the name of the field adjuster who paid them. She did not threaten anyone. She did not scheme. She sent 1 telegram and paid for it in coins and walked home in the cold. All she had done was open a door she had shut the day she came to this town to disappear. But she had opened it. And on the other side of that wire, in a city 800 miles away, a clerk was already pulling a file with her old name on the tab. And things that had been settled for 2 years were about to come uncrossed. The county knew nothing. Vernon Crade slept easy in his mortgaged house, certain the nervous schoolmarm had seen nothing out here but chalk dust and weather. He was wrong about that. He was about to find out just how wrong. But the telegram had to travel first. And the answer had to travel back, and until it did. Cora Bellamy went on pouring the coffee and teaching the sums and carrying the whole ledger of Ash Hollow's ruin in a little oilcloth book that no one in the county would trouble themselves to open. The reply from Chicago was already moving west down the wire, and it was going to slide under the mercantile door at first light, in an envelope with her true name on it. On the very morning Vernon Crade decided the time had come to deal with the quiet woman himself. The answer came back on a Wednesday. It slid under the mercantile door before the sun was full up, an envelope with her true name on the tab, and she was awake to hear the paper scrape the boards. She had been awake most nights that week, not from fear, from arithmetic. She read it once by the window. Then she read it again, slower, the way she read everything. Chicago had confirmed her commission. Chicago had pulled the file. And Chicago had found what she already knew in her bones, that every barn that burned in Ash Hollow this season had carried a Meridian Mutual policy written fat, written weeks before the match. And that the field adjuster who paid them all shared a last name with a man who lived 4 miles down the Pardee Road. Deke Senate's cousin. The paper said it plainly. It said what no one in the county would say to her face. She folded the letter into the oilcloth notebook, between the page with the boot heel and the page with the groove. For 20 days now she had carried the whole thing in that little book and told not one living soul. The county slept. Vernon Crade slept easiest of all. He had patted her shoulder in front of 11 men and told the room she'd see nothing out here but chalk dust and weather, and 11 men had laughed, and he had gone home to his mortgaged house certain the matter was closed. He did not know a woman could stand very still and still be counting. But she was counting. She had 4 tells now and 4 men to hang them on. She wrote it out clean, 1 line each, the way she'd once written it out for a jury foreman who couldn't read her longhand. Crade, the clutch footheel, worn to the nails, set in the mud under Ada Dowell's tack-room window. The print of a man who drives a Rio with his weight always on the pedal. Tice, the twin grooves scored in the soft ground at the Pardee gate, the mark of a rear axle mended with a length of chain instead of forged steel, a thing only the liveryman in this township had ever done. Monday, the right print thrown deeper than the left. Because a horse rolled on his hip a decade back, and everyone in the county knew it, and no one thought a schoolteacher would. And Senate, no boot, no rig, No limp. Just paper. Policies written at twice what the barns were worth, matched line for line to the wire from Chicago. 4 men. 4 marks. 1 ring. The children came at 8, and she taught them their sums. Tommy Pruitt missed a carry in the tens column, and she corrected him without turning from the board. And the room went quiet the way it always did when she did that, half spooked, half proud. 31 children, ages 6 to 14, $40 a month, and she gave them every cent of teaching she had while a season's worth of ruin sat locked in her coat. She did not let it show. She had spent 2 years learning not to let things show. It was Elias Ford who moved the clock forward. He drove her supplies out on the Thursday the way he did, the frost still white in the wagon ruts and his breath hanging. He was a quiet man himself, widowed young, and he never once in all their frozen mornings talked to her the way the town did. He talked to her like she was a person who might know a thing or two. That morning he was troubled, and he told her why. Deke Sennett came out to the place, he said. Wrote my barn up for $1,100. I never asked him to. I told him plain I didn't want it. And he wrote it anyway, and now Crade's man says the note's due and the policy's the only thing standing between me and the bank. He shook the reins loose over the horse's back. It don't sit right, Miss Bellamy. My barn ain't worth $1,100. It ain't worth $6. She kept her face toward the road. Inside, everything went cold and clear. When did he write it, she asked. Tuesday last. She already knew the shape of it then. The ring did not pick barns because they were old, or dry, or badly kept. It picked them because the paper was ready. Sennett wrote a man's barn up fat, and then some night at 3 in the morning the barn burned, and Meridian Mutual paid out to Vernon Crade's benefit through whatever tangle of notes and liens the chairman had spun, and a farmer who never wanted the policy was left standing in the ash grateful to be alive. Elias Ford's barn was written up. That meant Elias Ford's barn was next. And the field adjuster was coming in 6 days to close the season's books. 6 days. After that, the payouts filed, and the money moved, and the trail went cold under snow. Whatever was going to be done had 6 days to be done in. She thanked Elias for the supplies. She did not tell him his barn was a target. She was not yet sure she had the right to frighten a good man before she had a room to do something about it. That afternoon she walked to the sheriff's office and asked Amos Dwyer for 10 minutes and a full room. He didn't want to give it. She could see that. He was a decent man wrung out past his decency, 1 election from losing his star. And a schoolteacher standing in his door with an oilcloth book was the last help he wanted the county to see him take. He'd thanked her for her coffee once and told her to leave the figuring to the county. He remembered it. So did she. A full room, he said, at the Grange. Every board member. The 4 I'll name. The widow Dowell. And you. You'll name 4 men. He rubbed his jaw. Miss Bellamy, do you have any notion what that does to a man to be named in front of his neighbors and it turns out wrong? I have every notion, she said. That's why I've said nothing for a month. He looked at her a long moment. He was out of leads, 4 barns gone, and the county laughing at him behind their hands. And here was a quiet woman offering him the one thing he didn't have, which was a name. He gave her the room because he had nothing left to lose that she could take. Sunday night, he said. The Grange. God help you if you're wrong. God help all of us if I'm right, she said, and went home to her lean to behind the mercantile. She had the letter from Chicago now. She had the notebook. She had one thing more to fetch. The second trunk stood against the wall of the shed where it had stood since October, under a stack of readers and a saddle blanket, unopened since the day Ruth Cobb had knocked the lid up by accident chasing a dropped slate. Cora knelt in front of it that night by the light of a single lamp and lifted the school books out one at a time. Beneath them, wrapped in a scrap of flannel, was a brass tag on a worn leather cord. 2 initials rubbed nearly smooth by handling, and beneath them the name of a firm. Thorne Ellison. She had carried it 800 miles to bury it, and she had buried it well, and now she lifted it out into the lamplight and closed her hand around it. She had come to Ash Hollow to disappear. To teach sums and pour coffee and be no one at all after the work she'd done in the city cost her more than she'd wanted to pay. She had shut this door with both hands. And now she'd opened it herself with 1 telegram and 40 cents because 3 barns had burned and a 4th was coming and no one else in the county could read what was written in the mud. She looped the cord over her neck and let the tag fall cold against her breastbone, under her collar, where no one would see it until she chose to show it. Then, Craig came to the schoolhouse. It was the night before the meeting, and she was alone, banking the stove, when the Rio's lamps swung across the windows. She heard the pedal, the particular way he rode the clutch. Before she heard his boots. He came in with his hat in his hand and a smile on his face, and he was, for the first time since she'd known him, uneasy. She could smell it under the friendliness like smoke under a closed door. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Working late. You work too hard for what this county pays." "There's always another sum," she said. "That's just it." He turned his hat by the brim. "A woman of your gifts, wasted out here on 40 a month and a shed to sleep in. It's a shame, and I've said so to the board. I've said, we ought to see Miss Bellamy right." He let that sit. "There's a better district opening in the spring. Down near the county seat. 60 a month, a boarding house, real society. I could see your name put up for it. I'd like to." There it was. A bribe wearing a favor's coat. Take the raise. Take the transfer, be gone by spring and quiet about it. He'd heard, somehow, that she'd asked Dwyer for a room. He'd come to buy the room out from under her the night before it opened. She let him think it worked. "That's very generous." "Mr. Craig," she said. "I hardly know what to say." "Say you'll think on it." He put his hat on, pleased, the unease draining out of his face now that he'd read agreement into hers. "You've a good head for all they say. You know how to mind your own business. That's worth more out here than any list." He tipped the brim to her. "Good night, Miss Bellamy. Sleep easy." "Good night," she said. "You too." He drove off, certain he'd bought her. She stood at the window and watched his lamps go, and she thought, without heat, that a man who thinks stillness means it can be purchased has never once understood the still. Then it was Sunday night, and the Grange filled. They came in stamping the cold off their boots. The 11 board members, Craig at their head, easy again, sure of the fix he thought he'd made. Roy Tice by the wall, thick hands folded. Halbert Mundy near the stove, favoring the hip. Deke Sennett by the door, where a man likes to stand who wants a way out. Ada Dowell, the widow, veiled and small. Elias Ford, hat in his lap. And Sheriff Amos Dwyer at the front, arms crossed, jaw set. A man who'd staked his last standing on a schoolteacher and knew it. Cora Bellamy came to the front with her oilcloth notebook. The room half laughed to see it. There was the nervous schoolmarm and her little lists, come to read her scribbles to the grown men who lost their livelihoods. Craig smiled. He'd heard this joke before. He'd told it. She opened the book. She did not accuse anyone. She reported, the way she'd been trained to report, in a voice that did not shake because she had not let anything shake in 2 years. 3 barns have burned in this county since September, she said. The Kessler place. The Voigt place. Ada Dowell's, in the tack-room. Every one insured by Meridian Mutual for more than it was worth. Every policy written within a month of the fire. I want to tell you what was in the mud. The room quieted despite itself. You wanted a fragile city girl, she said, who'd mind your children and see nothing. She lifted her eyes and found Craig's. "Mr. Craig, your left heel is worn to the nails on the clutch of a Rio. That's the print set in the mud under Ada Dowell's tack-room window. At 3 in the morning, the night her barn burned. A man on foot doesn't wear a heel like that. A man who rides a clutch does. There's one Rio parked nearest the Grange door tonight. It's yours. You bought it on credit." Crade kept smiling. But something moved behind the smile, the way a floor moves before it gives. She turned a page. Roy Tice. The liveryman's head came up. At the party gate there's a twin groove scored in the ground, the width of a freight axle, and one side of it drags because the axle's mended with chain instead of steel. You mended your own rear axle with a length of trace chain last spring. Half the town watched you do it. That's your rig's signature in the dirt at a barn that burned, and no other wagon in this township carries it. Tice half rose from the bench. Every eye went to him. He looked at the faces, and he sat back down, slow, and that sitting down said more than any word could have. Halbert Mundy. The man by the stove went still. A horse rolled on your hip a decade back. Everyone here knows it. It throws your right foot down harder than your left. You've walked that way as long as I've been in this county. There's a print in the frost at the Ostrander place, the night it burned, where the right heel drove in half again as deep as the left. One man in Ash Hollow walks that print. I've watched you cross the road. Mundy shifted his weight off the bad hip. He did it without thinking, the way he'd done it 10,000 times, and the whole room saw the very limp she'd named. And his face went gray with the understanding that he'd just shown them the thing that hanged him. And Deke Sennett. Sennett's hand was already on the door. You didn't leave a boot or a wheel. You left paper. You wrote the Kessler barn at 1800 and it wasn't worth 9. You wrote the Voigt barn fat. You wrote Ada Dowell's fat. And last Tuesday you wrote Elias Ford's barn at 1100 against his plain refusal, because Elias Ford's barn is next, before your cousin closes the season's books. Your cousin. The Meridian Mutual Field Adjuster who pays every claim you write. It's all on the wire from Chicago. Line for line. Sennett pulled the door. Dwyer's deputy was on the other side of it. Sennett stood there with the cold coming in and nowhere in it to go, and he shut the door himself, quiet, and turned back into the room a smaller man than he'd walked in. Now there was only Crade. And Crade was still smiling, because Crade was the head of the thing, and a head learns to smile through worse than this. He stood up slow, spreading his hands to the room, the benefactor, the chairman. Reasonable. This is a sad performance, he said. A nervous woman with a book of guesses. Boot prints, wheel ruts. You'll believe a schoolmarm's scribbles over your own board chairman? He shook his head, sorrowful, working the room the way he always worked it. You can't prove I was within a mile of the Dowell barn. The room held its breath. Cora closed the notebook. I never said which barn was yours, Mr. Crade, she said. I named a print under Ada Dowell's tack-room window. I never told this room the fire was set from the tack-room side. Only the man who said it would know to argue the Dowell barn. She let it land. You just told everyone here you were near the one barn I could put your boot beneath. The smile went. It didn't fall all at once. It came apart slow, feature by feature, the way ice goes off a pond in the thaw, and underneath it was a man who had overnamed the one thing that could hang him, in front of 11 neighbors and a sheriff, and knew it. Dwyer uncrossed his arms. There's one thing more, Cora said, and it's not mine to say. It's the county's. She looked to the sheriff. The wire came back from Chicago Wednesday. Sheriff, you should read it, not me. Amos Dwyer took the folded paper from her hand. He was a man who'd told her to leave the figuring to the county, and now the county stood in his boots, and he unfolded a schoolteacher's telegram in front of the whole Grange and read it out in his own slow voice. It confirmed a commission. It confirmed a records check. And it named the woman who'd requested both, not Miss Bellamy, the nervous schoolmarm, but an operative who had once worked cases for the Thorne Ellison Detective Agency in Chicago before she left that life and came west to teach 31 children and be left alone. The Grange made a sound, not a gasp, something lower. The sound a room makes when everything it was sure of turns over at once. Dwyer lowered the paper. He looked at her, and the mockery he'd carried for a month was gone out of his face, and what stood in its place was the plain respect of a man forced to it by a paper he could not argue with. "That true?" he asked. Quiet, just the two of them, for a second, in a full room. "It's true," Cora said. "I came here to stop being that. But the barns kept burning, and I found I couldn't watch it and stay stopped." Dwyer nodded once. Then he turned to his deputy and to the four men, and he did the thing he'd been elected to do and hadn't been able to until a woman nobody would meet handed it to him. He arrested them where they sat. No gun left a holster. There was no need. The room had heard it. The paper had said it. Tice went without a word. Mundy went slow, on the hip. Sennett went from the doorway he'd never gotten through. And Vernon Crade went last, still trying, all the way to the door, to find the joke in it, the angle, the room he could work, and finding, for the first time in his life, a room that would not laugh. In the middle of all of it, Elias Ford stood up. He had learned what she was at the same moment as everyone else. He had sat there and heard that the quiet woman who rode beside him on frozen mornings had been someone else entirely. Someone with a past and a name and a firm behind her. And a man might have felt fooled by that. A man might have looked at her different. Elias crossed to her through the noise, and he took off no favor and asked no question. He only said her name. Miss Bellamy. The same as he'd always said it. Nothing changed in it at all. And that was the whole of what he had to say. And it was enough. And she understood that of all the people in that grange, he was the only one who had seen her plain from the start and did not need the telegram to tell him who she was. Spring came late that year, but it came. By April, the drought had broken enough to green the ruts, and the schoolhouse windows stood open again. And if you walked the Pardee Road of a morning, you could hear 31 children reciting their sums through the gap, the 6s and the 7s carrying out over a country that had stopped burning. Cora Bellamy sat at her desk in the sun with a stack of slates to grade and the window open beside her. She was not hiding anything anymore. The brass tag lay out on the sill where the light could find it, 2 worn initials and a firm's name, no longer buried under any reader, no longer wrapped in flannel in a trunk against a shed wall. Just a thing that had happened to her, set out in the sun like a stone off a beach. The county paper had run the trial through the winter. It had given each man his dry line. Roy Tice, bound over on the evidence of a wagon he'd mended himself in front of witnesses. Halbert Mundy, undone by the walk his neighbors had watched for 10 years. Deke Sennett, whose cousin at Meridian Mutual was pulled in beside him when the company froze every payout in the county and sent its own men to ask the questions Sennett had gambled no one would. And Vernon Crade, Township Board Chairman, Land and Grain Man, who the paper noted in a single line had named, unprompted, a barn the state never placed him at, and had not been able to explain since why he'd known which window. Meridian Mutual paid out nothing. The notes Crade had spun came uncrossed one by one, and the men who'd have been ruined by fire were left, instead, only poorer and alive, which in that country in that year was a kind of wealth. Elias Ford's barn still stood. That was the plainest proof of all. It had been written up fat and marked for the match in the season's books meant to close over its ashes, and instead it stood in the spring light with the door open and a new colt in the stall, because a woman had read the paper before the paper could read like an obituary. He came by on a Saturday and climbed onto the roof of her lean-to without being asked and mended the place where the winter had worked a leak. She brought him coffee and he drank it on the ridgeboard, and they didn't say a great deal, which was how they both liked it. The community, in its small way, looking after its own. She never did go to the better district near the county seat. 60 a month, and real society. She stayed on at 40, and the shed, and taught the sums, and corrected Tommy Pruitt's carries without looking up, and the town that had withdrawn 3 lodging offers because they'd decided she was delicate now tipped their hats to her on the road and were a little afraid of her and a little proud. The way you are of a thing you almost threw away. The sharpest eye in the county had been the one nobody bothered to meet. They'd looked at a quiet woman unpacking a trunk of primers and decided there was nothing behind the stillness worth the trouble of knowing. They'd been wrong about that, all of them. the whole laughing room of them, and it had cost them a season of barns to learn it. Cora graded her slates in the sun. The brass tag caught the light on the sill. Out the open window the children counted, 6 and 7 and 8, on into numbers that hadn't burned, in a town that had finally learned to look twice. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to see how far this one travels. The light that particular morning came in low and golden through the east-facing window, the kind that makes dust look like something worth keeping, and it lay in long strips across the plank floor between the desks and made the whole room feel like the inside of something that had survived. The chalk dust hung in it. The smell of cedar shavings and wet wool, and the iron stove's particular warmth, which was different from any other warmth in the way that places become different from other places once enough of the same life has happened inside them. She turned a slate over and corrected it without ceremony, the way she had always corrected things, quietly, and with the same pressure regardless of who was watching. The tag on the sill was warm to the touch by mid-morning. She did not look at it often, but she knew it was there the way you know any object that has changed its meaning without changing its shape. Outside, the pasture ran green to the fence line and past it. The new colt moved at the edge of what she could see from her chair, unhurried, the way young things move when nothing is after them. The counting went on behind her, steady and serious, 7 carries and then 8, the children working the numbers with the particular concentration of people who have not yet learned to distrust their own arithmetic. The town was quiet at that hour. The road held only ordinary things. A wagon. A dog across the ditch. Somebody's laundry on a line in the pale distance, filling with the same slow wind that moved the schoolroom curtain and cooled the coffee she had set on the corner of the desk and forgotten, as she always forgot it, in the middle of something more exact.